As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
All right. The next one here, U.S. weapons in Ukraine funneled to arms traffickers and criminals. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that the Pentagon Inspector General found the arms Washington sent to Kiev did not undergo the required inspections. A report from the Inspector General found weapons the U.S. sent to Ukraine in the hands of criminals and on the black market. So the Arms Control Act requires that the White House establish an inspection system for weapons that the U.S. sells or gifts to third countries. And this law mandates the monitoring continues to the end use of the weapon. In Ukraine, the embassy in Kiev has been assigned responsibility for monitoring the weapons transfers. The Department of Defense Inspector General report on American weapons transfers to Ukraine from February to September of last year found that legally required monitoring was not taking place. This report said, quote, "The DoD is unable to conduct end-use monitoring in Ukraine because completing end-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy requires in-person access to the defense equipment provided. Intelligence methods provide some accountability for observable platforms such as missiles and helicopters, but smaller items such as night vision devices have limited accountability," end quote. So, this is something I'm always worried about, that they could take these oversight concerns and kind of use it as a pretext to, get more involved in the war by sending more military personnel to Ukraine to conduct inspections of these weapons, which they actually did last year. I believe it was August 2022. The Pentagon announced that that there's military personnel in Ukraine conducting on-site inspections. Just a few dozen people, but still, it's an example, of mission creep, how the U.S. could be more involved. So Netanyahu was in and out of the hospital a few times, and he's out, and he's saying he's going to attend. The Knesset is scheduled to vote on this very controversial judicial overhaul on Monday. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he would still attend a key judicial reform vote on Monday, despite having an unscheduled pacemaker implanted in him overnight Saturday. Netanyahu said that he was doing excellently after the operation and plans to jump right back into the work of overhauling Supreme Court powers that has brought nationwide protests to a boil and stirred calls for compromise. With the country ensnared in its worst domestic crisis in decades, President Isaac Herzog on Sunday met Netanyahu in the hospital in hope of closing the rifts between the religious nationalist ruling coalition and opposition parties. So Monday is going to be a big day in Israel. There's been huge protests, and all sorts of people, the military people, are very against this, and reservists saying that they won't serve if they pass this. So we'll see how the vote is. Netanyahu and his coalition seem pretty determined to push this thing through. All right, the next one here, the U.S. is sending Marines and warships to the Middle East over Iran tensions. So U.S. Central Command announced on July 20th that the U.S. was deploying a Marines Corps unit and additional warships to the Middle East amid heightened tensions with Iran. So the command said in a press release that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the deployment of an amphibious readiness group / Marine expeditionary unit, which typically consists of about 2,200 Marines and 3 amphibious warships. So it's pretty decent-sized force. And CENTCOM said that the deployment was ordered in response to recent attempts by Iran to seize commercial ships. So Iran seized 2 vessels in the Persian Gulf region after the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in the region in April. So it was the U.S. seizing that ship, forcing this tanker to go to the U.S., that really sparked this latest, whatever, if you want to call it a tanker war, whatever you want to call it. And since then, the U.S. has announced, it's conducting more patrols in the Persian Gulf and sending more military assets to the region. They just recently sent F-16s and other fighter jets, again, in the name of this protecting these ships from Iran. And they also sent a guided missile destroyer. So the U.S., I covered this last week, the Suez Rajan is the name of the U.S. Seized ship, the ship that the U.S. seized. I don't want you to think it's a U.S. ship, but right now it's still off the coast of Texas, and it's struggling to unload its cargo, which is Iranian oil, because American companies are fearful that if they take the oil, then Iran might retaliate in the Persian Gulf by seizing one of their tankers. So it's kind of an. Last one here is an article from NPR. The U.S. dismissed evidence of civilian deaths in Baghdadi raid. So this is the second time in recent weeks that we're running an article from NPR. It's definitely a rare occurrence, but so this is interesting. Confidential documents obtained by NPR provide new details about one of the most celebrated U.S. military operations in recent history and reveals flaws in the Pentagon's claim that deadly airstrikes did not hit civilians. So this was in 2019 that U.S. Special Operations Forces raided the Syrian hideout of ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leading him to blow himself up. Then President Donald Trump called the raid impeccable, and military officials said that troops protected non-combatants. The Defense Department dismissed the accounts reported by NPR of U.S. helicopter fire killing and maiming Syrian civilians during the raid. The Pentagon said those men were enemy combatants who ignored warning shots. So NPR sued the Pentagon under the Freedom of Information Act to release documentation of the airstrike, and it obtained a redacted copy of the Defense Department's confidential 2020 report on the incident. The report was originally classified as secret with no foreign distribution. NPR's review of the document, including aerial imagery from the operation, finds that U.S. troops fired warning shots mere seconds before launching airstrikes on the Syrian men's van. This undermines the military's assertion that the men demonstrated hostility by failing to stop or change course. The Pentagon provided no evidence that the victims were enemy combatants, but beyond the split-second assessment by U.S. troops on the dark night of the raid. U.S. officials did not compile an intelligence dossier as recommended in the report. The Pentagon questioned the veracity of accounts given to NPR by the airstrike survivor and families of the victims, but it did not contact their survivor or conduct a full formal investigation. So it got these reports that they might have killed civilians, and they didn't do any kind of follow-up investigation, which is not surprising because the Pentagon, this is pretty typical of the Pentagon. And they also, the NPR spoke with the Syrian survivor. So it was one man that survived these airstrikes that was killed with two friends that he was with. So two of them were killed. One guy survived. He lost his arm. And he is saying that NPR, that is him and his two friends were working as agricultural laborers, and they were driving him home. And the Pentagon story is that they were militants unaffiliated with ISIS, which kind of doesn't make sense. Why would militants unaffiliated with ISIS try to engage with these U.S. troops if they think that they're raiding al-Baghdadi? And this guy's saying they didn't know that he was hiding out there. But it's just another case of how the Pentagon handles civilian casualties. They're not afraid to lie about it or just try to sweep it under the rug.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Look, there's this dynamic where, as somebody who's been a sharp critic of Donald Trump, it's remarkable, truly remarkable, how much his supporters will bend over backward to make excuses for him. And what's interesting about it is that it's not, look, it's one thing when if I argue with someone who is a liberal who thinks Fauci was great and all of the COVID, policies were wonderful, and I'm just denying the science, or whatever. That's kind of one thing. And of course you have a certain type of argument with that person. But there's something almost more frustrating about arguing with a Trump supporter who absolutely will acknowledge that all the COVID policies were terrible, that the vaccine was sold based off lies, that the lockdowns were horrific, all of these things. And then I'll go, but Trump's the guy who made Fauci the face of the pandemic response in 2020. Like, how do you defend that? And they agree with every one of our positions on that, but they'll still go, well, he was misled, or he had no choice but to do that. And you're like, yo, wait, what? Like, he was misled, and so he fell for it? That's his fault still, And so it's interesting to hear Trump at least kind of acknowledge this. Oh, yes, some of the people weren't that good.
This is exactly the way the way people without character behave. That you're on the campaign trail. I'll get it done in one day. No one's ever been more competent. Yeah. No one's better. Give me 1 week. Everything will be solved. I'm a winner. You'll win too. I'll get it done. Well, you didn't get anything done. What happened? Oh, I didn't know how to do the job, and so I hired bad people. That's called not having character.
Yeah,
when you're out there
that's
going,
the job. That's the job, dude. And look, he can say, and look, I will say, I find something about this kind of endearing because it's like I've never seen this out of Trump before. There's a real moment there where he goes, look, I'm from New York. I'd never been to Washington before. And I'm looking at Melania and I'm like, can you believe it? Can you believe we're in the White House now? Okay, I get that. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, dude, this is ultimately the problem with Donald Trump. The job was to have once read a book about something, to know something, dude, to know, how do you not know? How do you have this much bravado that I'm going to drain the swamp and still not know that fucking Bill Barr isn't the guy to do that? And you went, we're spending all this money over there. We have problems here. You couldn't just, if the response to that was, oh, so you're saying government spending programs at home work great? It's like, no, that doesn't follow at all. I'm just saying, don't spend the money over there. That doesn't mean I say the government should spend the money here. I'd like government to not spend the money at all. That's a perfectly reasonable position to take. So he gets this completely wrong. And And at the end of it, he says, you can be skeptical of Ukrainian military aid while being in favor of entitlement reform. You sure can. Me and Rob are both skeptical of Ukrainian military aid and pro-entitlement reform. He says, second off, the notion that America has no interest in Ukraine is untrue. We have an interest in the Russian military being defanged, so they do not invade surrounding nations, thus threatening global supply chains and strengthening American opponents. We have an interest in deterring China from invading Taiwan.
Oh my God. Let me at him. Let me at him, Dave.
Go ahead.
Oh
Rob.
my God. The fucking left. Firstly, you're ignoring just countless deaths. But fine. Let's just go with strategic interests. We don't care. You and I, we don't care about human lives. Kill as many as Ukrainians as you want if it's in the American interest. Let's just imagine that scenario for a second. All right. So you're securing supply lines. What the fuck are you talking about? You just took out a pipeline that had trade between Russia. They're talking about all these breadbasket issues of people not being able to get enough food. And guess what? If we weren't all tied down in this Russia thing, you might have a better chance at actually opposing the Taiwan thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, what has been worse for supply chains than America picking a side in this war? It's just like, it's just bonkers, man. It's like anyone can they can always come up with these rationalizations. Like, you know, I'll have people still to this day.
But the point is, and not caring about death, completely ignoring the fact that you've destroyed a country and you're losing a ton of life, and pretending like these strategic interests are actually worth that cost. And even if they were, which I don't think they are, and you'd be really evil to take that perspective, one, you got no proof that Russia was invading any other countries. You got no proof of that whatsoever. And two, everything you just labeled as a strategic concern, you actually have a bigger problem with now.
It's so eclipsed by where you are on this war in Ukraine. It's just way more important as president. And this to me, he's just completely disqualified. Completely disqualified. If you can't come out against this insane policy and you have to like do whatever the hell it is that he just did, whatever that is, just say nothing and ramble about how you're going to be more hawkish on these other countries that also, by the way, pose no threat to us. Oh, Iran. Yeah. You know what the answer to the crisis in Ukraine is? We should bomb Iran. That's the answer. This is just too insane to me. And I think from what I've seen of where the Republican base is at, certainly where that audience at the Blaze event that Tucker Carlson was hosting, where they're at, I think this is not going to be good enough for them either. I think DeSantis is toast. There's two options here. There's two possibilities here, I should say. Either he actually opposes this war, but doesn't have the balls to say it because it might offend his donor class, or he actually supports the war, but doesn't have the balls to say that he completely supports it because that'll offend his voting bloc. Either one, to me, disqualifies him. If he actually opposes this war, but doesn't have the balls to say it to offend his donors, then how can I count on you when you actually get in there to do the things that are going to offend all of these powerful people? And if you support the war and are just trying to win votes, then you're disqualified to me as well. This is the most important issue, and he is failing it. So I'm done. I'm done with DeSantis. I'm interested in the campaigns that RFK is running. I'm interested because you can't not be. It's just too entertaining. In Donald Trump. I'm interested in Vivek Ramaswamy. I'll get it right eventually. I'm interested in who the Libertarian Party is going to put up as their candidate. I'm interested in Cornel West. I find all of these guys interesting.
And I don't think most of NATO. I know the Germans don't want to go to war. I think other folks in the Union don't want to go to war. I think that would be by the way, I think that would shatter NATO. If they did that, NATO would basically say, I can no longer support being a member. I no longer support Article 5, which ends the alliance. So I think people understood the moment you say yes to Ukraine, you say no to NATO. And I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm not sure if that's a bad idea at this point, but that's what the reality would be.
Right. Here's Secretary of Defense Austin. So this is 10 days ago, right after Vilnius being asked point blank.
Yeah.
Should Ukraine join NATO?
So you have no doubt that after the war, Ukraine will become a member of NATO?
I have no doubt that will happen. And we heard just about all the countries in the room say as much. And I think that was reassuring to President Zelensky.
He didn't sound very credible to me. But what would Russia do if Ukraine became a member of NATO? I mean, this is like declaring World War III.
It is. And I think that's the issue. The Budapest Accord, I believe, is the name of it, from 94, when the separation of Ukraine and Russia was finalized, creating Ukrainian independence. The agreement was no nukes in Ukraine, nukes go back to Russia. And then on our side, British included, no eastward expansion of NATO. So those agreements have long since been broken. And I for one, have always said, you need to recognize, even if you don't agree with it, the fact that the Russians have legitimate issues, traditions, and cultural concerns that go back generations. So the moment you start, it's like I was talking to one of my colleagues who was a very staunch conservative yesterday about this. And it's like, well, we would never accept Mexico becoming a Soviet satellite. Probably not. Probably that would have been a bridge too far, and we would have not stood for Mexico becoming essentially an organization that a country that responded to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I don't know why people think it's different with them. The Russians have a lot of issues that go back generations. So I think ignoring those issues, Judge, is part of what's brought us to this point in time. And the moment you put another nation, NATO nation, on the border of Russia, I think Russia is going to look at how it can become more aggressive in pushing things back. They have an inherent paranoia. I'm not here to support it. I'm just telling you they have an inherent paranoia that's going to result in a global war if you continue to push them.
Isn't their paranoia rational when Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush said NATO won't move 1 inch eastward, and it's now 800 miles eastward? And you're right. Think of how we would react if Mexico became a satellite of Russia or of China, and they had missiles and they're aimed at Dallas and Miami. How would we react?
I'm completely with you. And it's like our side, this cultural projection. It's like, oh, well, we're the good guys. No, I don't trust our good guys. I've seen the good guys from the inside. No, they ain't so good. So I think we need to recognize that left to Western devices, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, and Biden, because I think he doesn't have any ability to discern or push back, would actually push for a war.
The issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he can end the war tomorrow. He can just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine if he's already lost that war.
An embarrassment at an international function that was in Helsinki 10 days ago. But can he possibly believe or even understand what he's saying, Tony?
So, I think I'm one of those who've been calling for his impeachment for a long time. I think it's long overdue. The simple fact that he would say something that's so completely detached from reality is of grave concern. Anybody who studies the war for any length of time understands the dynamics, and Putin is not in any jeopardy, either domestically. I think the whole Prigozhin thing was designed in some ways. Maybe he was aware that was going to happen and was able to use that, as Stalin did, to kind of purge people who were disloyal. I mean, as I've said before, Judge, you can take the man out of the Soviet. You can't take the Soviet out of the man. And I think they're still using Soviet tactics to govern. So I think that's one aspect. Second aspect is the numbers. The Russian economy is on wartime footing. They are outproducing the West, the whole West, by about 10-1 across the board. And plus, they have found alternate sources of high-tech gadgetry. Iran, China, they're in no danger, and they've worked around the sanctions. So I just don't see how Biden has any ability, if he's any copacetic at all. Compos mentis. What is that term? Is it Latin? He's like he's non-compos mentis.
Right.
He is not, and because that's
in control of his own brain.
Yeah. So someone told him to say that, and it's Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken, which I think they are criminally, liable for the stupidity which he's exhibiting. Judge, do you remember during World War II, D-Day, when Eisenhower first sent in the artillery and put them on the beach, and then he waited about 2 days, and then he sent in the troops, and then after that they sent in the B-17s to bomb the rear area, and then after that they really allowed them to have jeeps for the men to kind of run around. Remember how this was laid out over 6 months? They did the Normandy invasion over 6 months. I'm being completely a smartass here. That's my point.
Right.
Eisenhower hit them with everything we had on June 6, 1944, an overwhelming use of military force, the biggest armada, the biggest air assault ever to that date, everything at once. It was a strategy based on the knowledge of how the Germans processed information and then knowing where their weaknesses were. That's war. What John Kirby is laying out is the same basic format of throwing money at something and hoping for the best that screwed up our education system across the board. Just throwing money at it, no strategy.
So how much longer does this last, Tony?
Well, it can't last indefinitely. I think, look, it's gone past my prediction. I thought we'd be done at least into talks by now. I thought June would have gotten us to talks based on what I thought would have been rational people in the room. I think it's going to go another 3 months at the current kind of issue. The next big issue, I think, is going to be the fall rains. The rains are going to have an effect on the battle space. I don't think either side's going to want that. I think the Ukrainians, because they are not doing well, just a little note. I mean, they publicly acknowledged 20% loss of Bradleys. I think it's closer to 30. Every Bradley maintainer on the planet is heading to Poland to help recover these things. We're sending more stuff. I think they're going to do this piecemeal Battle of Kursk nonsense probably till October, unfortunately.
And right now, you know, it was announced just a month ago or so that the Ukrainians are under pressure from us. We had to go in there and have a counter-offensive against the success of the Russians. Yeah. So they were all set to do this, but then it wasn't doing so well, and then it's back and forth. But our government keeps pushing them anyway, even though we argued at the time that it was foolish to start it, it was ridiculous. And it turns out that they knew about how bad it was. And the Wall Street Journal had an article out and said, you know, the officials knew that it was a no-win situation, and it's bad, but give us more money. So they keep doing that. Even today, they have, even though now the article came out with information that you know, a good person in the military could understand and probably predict this from early on, and that is what is happening. It was totally unsuccessful, and now they're admitting we knew it all along. Of course, they're not saying it that way, but that's what the Wall Street Journal, who was very, very hawkish, admitted. They weren't ready for this. Why in thunder are we doing this for?
Yeah, and the people who warned that this would be the outcome were completely ignored. I mean, we've talked about people like Colonel McGregor and Larry Johnson and others, Scott Ritter, they've all spoken at our conferences. They were saying this all along, and they were just dismissed as, just pro-Russian defeatists. But now we have the Wall Street Journal starting to spill the beans a little bit. Put on that first clip if you can. This is the article, and everyone's talking about this article because it's rare when the mainstream media tells some truth, and when it does, it's shocking. The article is titled, "Ukraine's Lack of Weaponry and Training Risks Stalemate in Fight with Russia." And go to the next one. Here is the operative phrase. When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces. But they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. It's an astonishing sentence, Dr. Paul, because they knew they didn't have what it takes to do what they said they were going to do, which is take back parts of Ukraine that Russia had occupied. They knew they couldn't do it, so their strategy was simply to hope that they did it. I mean, I've never seen such cynicism on display before, is that it's like, oh yeah, well of course we knew all along that they weren't going to be able to do this, you know. After 5 weeks of grueling battles, they estimate over 25,000 men have died in these 5 weeks in this counteroffensive. And when it hasn't gone anywhere, they haven't even reached the first fortified lines in southern Ukraine, first of at least 3 or 4, depending on what part of that area there are. They haven't even reached the first lines, and they've been slaughtered. And so what do? Someone from the administration leaks to the Wall Street Journal, oh, well, we knew all along that they weren't going to do it anyway. We just kind of hoped that they would. So it's really the height of cynicism. But at the same time, you could also talk about how this is what happens when you believe your own propaganda. I mean, it's a circular reasoning. When people like McGregor and Ritter and those are saying, look, based on our experience, this is what's going to happen. This is not what you're saying. They just refuse to listen, like they did with COVID and other things, and something we're going to talk about later today. They just refuse to listen and refuse to consider any outside voices that would interfere with the narrative that they had, constructed. It's like the old thing that was from the Bush administration. We create our own reality, and that's what they do. And so, unfortunately, for Ukrainian men who are now fewer and further between, thousands and thousands have died because Washington hoped that they would do better.
That effort, and they draw these lines, and it has to be in many ways deliberate, because it's not an all-out war, fortunately, but it's an all-out effort to undermine a system of governments around the world and threaten a real war breaking out. I mean, a real war, about a big war. I'm talking about, all of Europe and all of Asia get involved in this. I think the money will run out before then. I don't think that's going to happen here in the near future, but I think the strategy of limited war and having lines drawn, and as long as we don't have our pilots flying those airplanes, that'll be okay, because maybe the Russians would shoot some of them down, and then that could be embarrassing. So the lines are artificially drawn for a war that is artificial.
Well, I'd hate to be Zelensky, because all he needs to do is look through a little bit of history and look what happens to the people who were the favorites: Noriega, Gaddafi, Saddam, Milosevic. It's not a good position, and they're going to start looking for someone to blame, and he's going to have to go to one of his hundreds of homes that he owns. Well, let's move on, because this is an interesting one. This is something we've talked about for a long time, which is silencing scientists whose views are not accepted by the mainstream. And this is from the Daily Skeptic. Cancellations start for John Clauser after Nobel Physics laureate speaks out about the corruption of climate science. An extremely distinguished physicist wins a Nobel Prize, starts talking about things like climate change in a way that the elites don't want, and he's canceled.
Right, and the one motivation that they have to have is fear, scare the people, you know, whether it's a virus or somebody's going to invade us or whatever it is. They have to scare and build up the fear. And they generally get away with this until somebody wakes up. But this mess that we have now, these people that are citing all these statistics, the hottest day in the world history. And, you know, people have already dissected that, and that's what this article is about. And this is why John Clauser, you know, has been revealing what he really believes. And isn't it amazing? When they were looking at him as a scientist, they give him the Nobel Prize. Yeah. You know, but they turn on him. Oh, he said something we don't agree with. He told the truth. Doesn't he know what these rules are? So that to me is such a tragedy. And I don't have any fear. I don't lie awake at night thinking, will the truth ever be known? No, the truth will be known. But tragically, there's going to be a lot of suffering in the meantime. And this whole thing about, just think, you know, the whole effort of lockdown on COVID probably did a lot more harm than good. But you would have ended up with more scientific evidence of what we should do and who should get shots and this sort of thing if it had been sorted out medically and scientifically rather than politically. And that's where the real problem is.